Welcome all to the next Quincy Institute webinar. And this one is on the change of government in Indonesia and the implications for the United States of a new president, Prabowo Subianto, taking office next week. The Quincy Institute is a foreign policy think tank based in Washington. We research and advocate a grand strategy of restraint for the United States, which means less military interventionism broadly and more diplomacy and more economic engagement. I'm Sarang Shidore, director of our Global South program. The Global South program aims to create a new relationship, a new bargain between the United States and this vast middle, which is fundamentally unaligned and is eager to build deeper partnerships with the United States based on common interests. And that is the thrust of the program at the Quincy Institute. Prabowo Subianto, of course, is going to take office, as I said, next week, October 20th, to be precise, as the new president of Indonesia. He won the election earlier this year by a wide margin. And since then, he has actually consolidated his majority in parliament. And Indonesia is at an interesting juncture at this time. There is enormous national optimism in many respects. Economics, the country has been growing strongly. It is projected to become the 7th largest economy in the world by 2030. So there's plenty of optimism in the air. Nevertheless, Indonesia also sits in a region and a world. And both of them are going through some stresses and challenges. There are global crises we have that affect everybody. So the questions we want to answer, not just these, but to start off, the three broader questions we want to sort of get at during this conversation. How could U.S.-Indonesia relations evolve under the new president? How will Jakarta and ASEAN, because Jakarta is embedded in this wider relatively successful regional grouping called ASEAN, how will Jakarta and ASEAN handle any further escalations in the region, if they happen? So we have the South China Sea, we also have Taiwan. What does Indonesia's continuing rise? And there's no doubt there's been a rise. But what does this rise mean for the impact of the broader global South, this developing world, as it used to be called, for the United States, which tends to be more focused on sort of great power rivals or core allies in the world system? So to engage in this conversation, we have three excellent guests today, and I'm going to read out their introductions, not the entire ones, because you have that on the webpage, but I'm going to try to give you a shorter version, and then you can look up more detail. First off, I have Ambassador Piper Campbell. Ambassador Campbell is inaugural chair of the Department of Foreign Policy and Global Security at American University School of International Service, and also chair of the ASEAN Studies Initiative. She served as head of the U.S. mission to ASEAN in 2018 and ambassador to Mongolia between 2012 and 2015. Ambassador Campbell left government in April 2019 after a 30-year diplomatic career with the rank of Minister Counselor. I also have Mark Mealy, who's joined us before at our events. He is the Senior Vice President Policy at the U.S. ASEAN Business Council here in Washington. Among other things, he serves as the in-house lead on international trade policy for the Council. He joined the Council in 2003 and was named Vice President in 2010 and then promoted to Senior Vice President in 2017. Mark has over 30 years of experience in international trade and commerce and economics, and has held positions in the U.S. government and the NGO community. Last but certainly not the least, we have Devi Fortuna Anwar from Jakarta. She is research professor at the Research Center for Politics, National Research and Innovation Agency, or BRIN, in Jakarta. Devi is also the chairman of the Institute for Democracy and Human Rights at the Habibie Center and an academician for the Social Science Commission at the Indonesian Academy of Science. In her long career, Devi has served as Deputy Secretary for Political Affairs, Deputy for Government Policy Support, and Assistant Minister of State Secretariat for Foreign Affairs. So welcome to all of you. I'm going to start with you, Devi, and get some insights here from Indonesia to start off. You wrote a very interesting and a must-read article in Foreign Affairs earlier this year, in which you spoke of strong continuity in Indonesia's traditional foreign policy, specifically non-alignment and the idea of bebas aktif, that Indonesia is essentially pursues an independent foreign policy. And of course, we know that historically Indonesia was a host of the very famous Bandung Conference in 1955, which in many ways, for that time, a different time, created the first forum for the Global South, for countries, newly decolonized countries to come together. But Prabowo is a very different person from the current president, Jokowi. He's more comfortable on the global stage. He has a background in the military. He's defense minister currently. How does Prabowo's strong and unique personality interact with the historical foreign policy that you laid out of continuity and non-alignment of Indonesia?
Right. Thank you, Sarang. It's a pleasure to be here. First, a slight correction. I'm no longer the chair of the Institute for Democracy and Human Rights. Somebody else who's the president. I'm chair of the board of directors of the Habibie Center. So I've been kicked upstairs since 2018.
Oh, apologies for that.
Yeah. Well, any Indonesian government has to stick to the core principle that free and active foreign policy is not a personality choice. It is written now. It was the Indonesian foreign policy doctrine laid out right in the middle of the Cold War in 1948 by the first Indonesian vice president to respond to then bipolar world as a new Indonesia was coming to terms with itself, as it was being wrapped internally by various ideological conflicts. The choice was, whether to join left or to join right, or to stay our own course. And that was the choice. So the free and active foreign policy was then a doctrine and has been now embedded into the Indonesian Foreign Policy Act. So any government must adhere to this. It is actually an impeachable sin. One of the reasons why Sukarno was removed from power was because he was accused of abandoning the free and active foreign policy principle by signing this Jakarta-Beijing axis at the time. So all presidential candidates, including vice presidential candidates Prabowo, clearly stated, I would continue to follow Indonesia's free and active foreign policy. So it is not a choice. But how each particular government leader interprets that is very different. Well, as you know, President Suharto said that he was restoring Indonesia's free and active foreign policy. But what he did was he froze diplomatic relations in China and more or less engaged Indonesia into a de facto military alliance with the U.S. during the Cold War. So the only time when Indonesia was really able to carry out a truly free and active foreign policy, engaging with all sides, was when the Cold War was ended. Because then, it was really able to engage with Washington, with China after the diplomatic relations have been restored, and with all other countries in the world. Now, Prabowo, if one looks at what he's been doing since he's been declared a winner in April this year, until last September, he was traveling. I've lost count how many countries visit. I think it's about 13 countries already, or 14. But he made it very clear that this is very much a free and active foreign policy trip. he first visited Beijing, and immediately after that, he went to Tokyo. He went to Moscow, and then he went to France. That. So this instinctive desire to be as broad and as diverse as possible, to show that Indonesia shows no favors to one side or the other, but all the countries that Indonesia are friends with, it's willing to engage with. So Prabowo will walk the talk, I think, and he is actually flown. He's actually done all this free. He's actually very active, and he's been very free. Clearly, as president, he will continue. He will be able to do this more. But maybe he will be less free to travel as much as he would have liked, as he focused domestically. But definitely, it will be a much more vigorous reiteration of Indonesia's free and active foreign policy principle.
Great. Ambassador Piper Campbell, I'm going to ask you about a question based on this excellent report that you wrote for the Asia Pacific Leadership Network. Everyone should try and get hold of it and read it if you can. And it's really about the Southeast Asian perspectives on the broader regional security questions. But you said something interesting that caught my eye in the report when I read it, that it's in the interest of the United States for Southeast Asian states to preserve foreign policy independence. This is not a commonly heard, explicitly heard, let's say, perspective in Washington. Why do you think that is the case? Why do you think it is in the U.S. national interest? And second, how does that translate into how the U.S. should operationalize its policies towards Indonesia under the new President Prabowo?
I also just want to thank Devi because she was very much a supporter of the of that APLN report and the conference that really inspired it. I think that that it's in the U.S. interest for the countries of Southeast Asia to be able to pursue exactly the kind of policy that Devi was just describing on behalf of Indonesia. When the countries of Southeast Asia operate under concepts like bebas aktif, and they not only have that confidence of autonomy and ability to make decisions in their national interests, but at the same time, they are externally oriented, they are active. And I think it's really important to look at how Indonesia has been so active in regional policy over time. As one of the leaders in the establishment of ASEAN, is clearly a leader within ASEAN, and to give Indonesia credit and to give ASEAN credit for having established the stability in the region, which has allowed the region to grow so quickly and to grow into the economic force that it is right now. And I think we can see, and I'm sure that Mark will speak to this even more, the advantages to the United States of being able to engage with the Southeast Asia, which is really a rising economic force, and one where the benefits to the United States of economic engagement and geopolitical engagement with Southeast Asia are so apparent. And so the report is based on a presumption that the countries of Southeast Asia want to maintain this independence, want, just as Devi was describing, to be able to engage with China, need to engage with China, and also want to engage with the United States. And so for the US to engage in that same manner, to build networks, to be thoughtful in working regionally, working in small mini-lateral engagements where there are shared interests, I think is strategic, smart, and effective. And I think it's important for Americans to be out there and expressing those views. As I think about incoming President Prabowo and the question of how he will engage with the United States, I think the fact that he has so much not only foreign policy experience from his prior role as defense minister, but experience living abroad, living outside of Indonesia, speaks excellent English, German, and other languages, I believe, and seems to have a global perspective. I think it's not coincidental that Indonesia has asked to join, expressed the desire to join the CPTPP in the incoming days of the Prabowo administration. And so I think we can sort of see or anticipate and predict that we're going to have an engaged and active Indonesia. And it's in the United States' interest for that to be the case. The US and Indonesia have had ups and downs in their relationship, just as there have been ups and downs in their US government engagement with Prabowo over time. But I think what we're seeing from both the United States and from Prabowo himself is an interest in putting that behind and moving forward.
Wonderful. I want to tell all the viewers we have who are watching this, thank you for joining us, first of all. But also, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box, and we will get to them shortly. I'm going to turn to you now, Mark, and I'm going to pick up on what Ambassador Piper Campbell said. She mentioned the globalist aspect of Prabowo. His resume certainly is globalist. There's quite a contrast with the current president, Joko Widodo, who's been much more of a domestically oriented president. But he's attracted foreign investment, and there's been enormous foreign investment that he's attracted and wooed. At the same time, he's also had a protectionist element in the national interest from his perspective, for example, on supply chains for batteries and the mineral nickel that's so important to that whole process. Indonesia doesn't export raw versions of that anymore. So if you compare Joko Widodo's 10 years, Prabowo's coming years, how would you lay out this dynamic between a Prabowo who, as Ambassador Campbell said, has a sort of a globalist eye, and then Joko Widodo's track record, and then look at the realities of the economy, which are the economy is booming broadly.
No, Sean, I think that's a great question, and I'm happy to segue following the ambassador's comment, because the question you're kind of getting at actually is an area that I think the U.S. private sector is also kind of grappling with or thinking through as we speak. Because I think we would agree that the economic performance of the last several years in Indonesia under the Jokowi administration has been positive in many respects. Who would have thought that 10 years ago, Indonesia would be now one of the world's most globally competitive destinations in the global, supply chains for electronic vehicles. I mean, that's a tremendous achievement in a relatively short period of time, and a function of good investments domestically, allowing foreign players to play a role in the domestic ecosystem, with a mix of, as you said, a degree of nationalistic kind of approaches to the minerals, putting export ban on the exportation of raw nickel, so to speak, so that supply is really now more geared towards domestic industry processing of that nickel. My sense is, and this is what we're thinking about, is that obviously I think there will be a degree of continuity with the Prabowo administration for things like the downstreaming in the mining industry. I don't think we would anticipate this new administration would say, okay, we're sort of done with that. We're no longer going to do that anymore. We're going to be on to something else now. I think the question really, though, is going forward, if we are at a period or the beginning of sort of an evolution, maybe in terms of the value placed on engaging external players and partners and participating in international trade agreements, how does the Prabowo administration go about executing this evolution? As Ambassador mentioned, we was pleasantly surprised to see the government of Indonesia today formally apply to become a member of the CPTPP agreement, which, if successful, would definitely represent sort of the highest standard of preferential free trade agreement that Indonesia would be participating in, so to speak. So that'll take some work some domestic reforms, some changes in order to successfully have that application go forward. In addition, as we know, Indonesia's government has also formally started a path to become a member of the OECD, another sort of external oriented framework that, if successful, would certainly have to be a catalyst for, again, driving certain types of domestic economic policy regulatory forms in the country in order to achieve that goal. So I think these are certainly, I think, positive signals that we're seeing from the current government, but potentially leading into the next government of Indonesia to how they want to move forward and build on the kind of successes that have been achieved. I think some of the areas that'll be really important to keep an eye on as we look at sort of this evolution, some of the key sectors ranging from obviously the digital economy, where again, Indonesia has demonstrated some capabilities and its improvements have attracted foreign investment. We've seen the growth of some tremendous technical startup companies that are now multi-billion-dollar businesses like Gojek, for example. That'll be an important area. Obviously, the energy transition arena represent another critical area, I think, for the incoming government to really focus on, because there's both opportunities, but also significant challenges for Indonesia to kind of move more towards the utilization and development of more sustainable sources of energy. And then another area that I think is going to be kind of interesting going forward, and it generally kind of touches on the broader topic of like sort of services, healthcare, education, those types of things. I think there is a recognition that in today's world, in order for Indonesia to continue to move towards an innovation-led, high productivity-led economic growth trajectory, human capital development, talent development is one of those areas where I think there's a need for continued focus and important investment. And I think all three of these areas, I think, represent opportunities for the U.S. private sector to play very active roles, along with other business communities that are investing in Indonesia, to be part of these transitions that I think the government of President Prabowo will be trying to lean and direct Indonesia going forward.
Great. I was struck by a couple of things you just said, Mark. One of them was on human capital, and here the United States really comes in with an advantage. We here have a world-class education system, certainly at the university level and beyond, and it's a source of enormous attraction. Students want to come and study here, and campuses here, universities here want to open campuses in Southeast Asia. Georgetown, I believe, is opening a campus in Jakarta in the coming, perhaps in a year or so. So there is that dynamic, a beneficial one for the US and Indonesia. I was also struck by how both of you and all three of you have mentioned Indonesia's plays in terms of joining these trade agreements. And I always feel a little sad that here in Washington, we have turned our backs entirely on talking about trade agreements. They've become a dirty word here in Washington. Whereas countries in the global south, developing countries, Vietnam, Indonesia, others, are saying, where is the openness that we used to see in Washington for decades, which always strikes me. But I'm going to turn to you now, Devi, and get to a slightly different. We are going to come back to the economic questions, but just switching gears a little bit. And Indonesia lives, of course, in a world. It's a major country, the world's fourth largest country. Many people in Washington don't know that, or at least in the United States don't know that. And there are global developments happening of concern to Indonesia. One of them is what's happening in the Middle East. If we zoom out to that, we've had a very serious conflict going on. There was a terror attack on October 7th last year against Israel. But in response, we have seen a very violent campaign by Israel in Gaza and now in Lebanon. Many innocents have died. There have been allegedly many war crimes that have taken place. And we have this very complex dynamic happening in the Middle East with many facets to it. Now, Indonesia has taken historically a strong position in favor of a Palestinian state. The United States supports a two-state solution as well. That's generally a broad consensus in the world. But given what's happening in the Middle East since last year, how much has this ongoing crisis affected America's reputation in this vast nation of Indonesia? And how will it limit or create barriers to relations going forward when Prabowo takes office next week?
Well, you mentioned the fact that Indonesia hosted the first Asian African Conference in 1955, the first Bandung Conference. In that Bandung Conference, all the participants, newly independent countries, supported the right of self-determination of all occupied peoples. Almost all of the occupied peoples in the world have already gained their independence. Palestinian was the one remaining homework. So the Palestinian issue, the support for Palestinian independence was already mentioned in the Bandung Conference. So for Indonesia, this is already regarded very, very much part of its foreign policy core. So all governments in Indonesia since 1955 was always said, we support the Palestinian independence. So there are many areas of where the United States and Indonesia had agreed or disagreed, but on this particular issue, Washington and Jakarta had diverted. In the past, it went off, every so often it will go up and go down, but it's not a matter that actually jeopardized bilateral relations so much. There are many things going on at the same time. But what is happening now, I think it's some different things. Because in the past, foreign policy is not really a matter for public concern, except when the Palestinian issue came along. Usually the general public didn't pay too much attention to it, except when the Palestinian issue came along. And now the Palestinian issue is not a side issue. Here, the numbers of deaths and the fact that it's not just that people have been killed in such a great number, but that what is seen to be selective application of international law, that countries that have stood up for international law, for human rights, for rules of law, are turning a blind eye on what Israel is doing, despite the UN, the ICG, ICC, all openly criticize Israel. But the fact, and also recently, that the UN, the General Assembly, the great majority of the international community firmly stood behind the Palestinian rights, to live in peace, to be independent, and so on. And then the United States and Israel and 12 other countries were the only one that voted against that. That put, frankly, the United States against the rest of the world. And that, that the right, that Israel can do no wrong. And that in order to protect Israel, the US is willing, in fact, to endanger its international reputation, put it that way. The moral high ground that it used to hold. The fact that by allowing international laws to be violated with such impunity in one part of the world, it makes it much harder for the United States to talk about international laws when other big countries are violating, principles. So the harms done to the US reputation is quite great. And the harms done to respect for international laws is probably even greater, and this is what is very, very worrying. And this is not about for the US, anti-China, pro-China against US. There's nothing to do that. So it is going to be very much more difficult, to win the hearts and minds of the wider public and the Indonesian public, who are. This is not the Muslim issues. This is an Indonesian issue and a global South issue. But I don't think it's only the global South countries that care about ending violence, protecting international law. So this is going to be quite damaging to the US. But Sarah, if I may, I would like to jump in on what Mark and Piper mentioned about
Please.
about economies and so on. So Mark's focused about downstreaming in the nickel industry and this and how Jokowi expects, of course, that Prabowo has put himself as a successor of Joko Widodo, therefore that he will carry out their legacy. And in fact, as Indonesia wants to move up the ladder to avoid the middle income trap, to become high income countries, as Mark mentioned, it has to be based on transformative economy. It has to be more on a human resources. Not Indonesia cannot simply rely on its natural resources. And now there is this understanding in Indonesia, look which countries are developed in our parts of the world. It's Singapore, it's Taiwan, it's South Korea, it's Japan, all countries that do not have natural resources. They were forced to innovate. They are forced to use, to improve their science and technology capacity. And they have to be much more creative and much more focused on industrialization. And now, so there is already a consensus among the Jokowi, the Prabowo people that downstreaming is a necessity. This is a national understanding now. All scholars, scientists, economists are talking about the same thing, that it has to be a knowledge-based economy. That means that you cannot simply send and sell off your primary commodities anymore, your rubbers and your agricultural product, your plantation products, your marine resources, your forestry products, your mining products. We are embarrassed with riches, with mineral resources. We need to be able to ensure that value added can be created within the country. And it's not just about smelters, the nickels, there should be more derivatives from there. Like palm oil, it's not just about sending CPO or stopping at biofuel. There are so many dozens of derivatives that can be created. And here, Indonesia will not be able to do it alone. If Indonesia is able to do it alone, we have done it. We would have done it many decades ago. Clearly, this is the role where Indonesia will need to work with countries that are much better advanced in education, in training, science and technology, and so on. And clearly bringing all of them, not just investors bringing money in, or bringing technology in, but also the know-how and everything. And that's how Indonesia at first developed when U.S. companies came in first. It brought the technology, the know-how as well. And we expect, the same thing to be open up, that kind of opportunities to open up to us again. So do not look at it as nationalistic, being protectionist and not willing to open up. But this is, it's a necessity for Indonesia if it wants to move up.
Indeed, we have in the United States also embraced industrial policy because there's a recognition in the United States, a genuine reality that there are folks that are hurting in the Midwest and elsewhere, and they need some support, they need jobs. And so it seems like we are in a world where countries are doing a mix and match. They're combining industrial policies and they're combining openness, attractions to trade and investment, going out and trying to sign trade agreements. At least most of the world is. Piper Campbell, I want a very quick response from you, not response really, but maybe addressing the Middle East question in terms of, is there an understanding, you think, in the U.S. Foreign policy community of the costs the U.S. might be paying, whatever the sides of the argument are, but the potential costs that the U.S. might be paying with third country relationships like Indonesia because of what's happening in, say, Middle East, or could be other theaters as well? Is there that sense of connecting these different regions and doing the math?
So I just would thank Debbie for the way she framed her answer on that. I thought it was really thoughtful, and the piece of her answer where she talked about this not only being a foreign policy issue, but a very domestic, a public issue, and impacting how people across Indonesia are thinking about the United States and thinking about support for international laws, is a message which is clearly being conveyed to the United States, including when we see things like the most recent Yusuf Ishak survey of the state of Southeast Asia. And that was the results, or the findings in that survey were notable. And I've certainly been in many discussions where that data has been referred to. I was somewhat pleased looking at the outcome statement of the just concluded East Asia Summit to look at the language in the statement about Gaza. It's very clear that in the East Asia Summit, there was a strong, fulsome discussion of Gaza. And of course, the United States was represented by Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, who's been really one of the leaders of U.S. engagement in the Middle East, trying to move the situation forward on Gaza and Israel. At the same time, we are in an election season in the United States. And just as domestic policy in Indonesia oftentimes shapes foreign policy, we're very much seeing the same thing at home. And while a concern exists and is communicated about the impact that the situation in the Middle East has globally on the United States and on U.S. standing, the United States is also very focused on supporting Israel and trying to push this situation forward in a way that avoids the risk of greater conflagration that we're seeing that risk sort of on a daily and hourly basis.
Great. Mark, let's switch gears back to the economic questions, which are so important in this conversation. We have recently had a U.S. Department of Labor report that talked about forced labor abuses, essentially, in the supply chain in Indonesia. This is with reference to be precise, Chinese companies employing Chinese labor. But the allegation is they are being subjected to ill treatment and exploitation. So here we have, obviously there are practices, there are things happening around the world that the U.S. Is often concerned with from the perspective of human rights. But I also always wonder, apart from the genuine concern that exists in the U.S. government on some of these issues, is there also a kind of a turbocharging happening of deploying, if not deploying, perhaps souping up some of these issues that may be genuine for reasons for other reasons, for protectionist reasons or other reasons that in some ways may not be constructive. Where do you think this balance is, and what would be a good way to go forward?
Yeah, I think there's been no question that the Biden administration has certainly been consistent in elevating a value in terms of international trade kind of relations on issues around labor standards, environmental standards, et cetera. I think that's certainly been a hallmark of the administration. It ties into, obviously, the administration's effort to try to, quote unquote, formulate a trade policy for the middle class or a trade policy for workers, all those kinds of efforts. My sense is that if we're talking in the U.S.-Indonesia context, there's a couple of dimensions that I tend to think about this. On a bilateral basis, for example, if we're just talking about U.S.-Indonesia economic relations or trade relations, two large countries in the world, I think many of us would say there's a lot more potential than the current reality in terms of, let's say, the bilateral trade relationship. There's lots more opportunities. The fact that, the United States has a trade relationship with a country like Vietnam, which is much, much smaller than Indonesia, but has a much bigger trade relationship, has always kind of made like what more could be done in a sense of maybe growing and expanding sort of U.S. Indonesia trade relationships. So I think in the Biden administration's approach to some of these kinds of questions, there have been efforts, there have been lots of talks, et cetera. And I think the Biden administration has highlighted the fact that one way that we could try to do more together would require the continued improvement of sort of labor standards in the Indonesian economy. And I think that is certainly something which I think President Jokowi's administration can appreciate, understand. That's a value that the United States has. And one could say, again, to what degree is there a carrot and stick? What degree is the opportunity there to take advantage? And of course, what degree are there areas of cooperation? And I think right now there are initiatives, for example, that are involving both governments working on trying to, again, figure out ways to improve labor standards, particularly in some of the areas of shared interest like mining, for example. We know these are conversations that are beginning to take place, both from the industry perspective, but also from the government. But I think the point that you're also getting at is that while those are legitimate issues, I think it's fair to say that here in Washington, we've certainly seen the growth or expansion of, how shall we say, non-economic related types of value propositions being woven into some of the efforts or some of the initiatives that the United States government has tried to make in its engagement with countries in the region. We see it in IPEF, where again, the IPEF process does include some commitments and language around labor and environment in the chapters of IPEF that have moved forward. Obviously, there's one whole chapter in IPEF that has not moved forward. That's the trade chapter. So there again, it's a more challenging process to find a consensus in that regard. But I think the concern, broadly speaking, beyond just sort of the bilateral context, is the fact that in the current environment where we're talking about the evolution of the U.S. China relationship, particularly in terms of the economic sphere, countries like Indonesia and others in the region, I think are thinking and trying to navigate how, again, as both of my colleagues have mentioned, how they can continue to pursue their own economic interests with both the United States and China, as opposed to some kind of a zero-sum choice, which would not be in their interests. And when trade partners like the United States are raising concerns around labor or environmental issues and or concerns around Chinese companies that are invested in Indonesia being part of the ecosystem there, which then potentially makes those Chinese companies part of the supply chain that may exist between the United States and China. These are concerns that are now having to be woven into some of the conversations and some of the negotiations between the two governments. I think for Prabowo administration coming online, we're already seeing some of these conversations inside Indonesia begin to emerge. And for example, there's already a conversation starting in Indonesia that kind of goes like, well, you know, if we'd like to maybe have companies in Indonesia that are producing products in certain industries that want to be part of a supply chain that maybe can plug into the United States and maybe have those companies in the United States be able to benefit from certain U.S. industrial policies. If the fact that our ecosystem does include operations that maybe have Chinese investment, should we think about maybe figuring out a way to maybe reduce the level of Chinese investment in some of those operations as a means of maybe addressing the concern of our trade partners in the United States? Obviously, that's an interesting discourse that's just now beginning to emerge in the country. And I think the Prabowo administration, while thinking about this, it's one of those questions of how do they find that balance? How do they figure out a way to saying, we're not trying to say we don't want foreign direct investment from China, Japan, Korea, or anyone. We're not trying to pick and choose. But if we want to take advantage of some of these other kinds of opportunities vis-a-vis the United States, and the vis-a-vis United States has these kinds of concerns, are there ways that we maybe can somehow address those concerns in a way that also supports our interests? It'll be a very interesting kind of discourse. And again, as I said at the outset, how to execute some of these types of threading the needle kind of efforts will be interesting to watch going forward.
Piper, you have something to say.
Yeah, and Sarang, I just wanted to agree with what Mark was saying and add on that I think the other aspect of I would say Indonesia's consideration right now also is in the security space, the space of the security of their systems, the security of their own supply chains. And as Indonesia looks at engaging both with the United States and engaging with China in many of these sectors, and a key consideration from the Indonesian perspective has got to be, do I have confidence that my computer systems, that my intelligence systems, et cetera, are working on systems that I control and that are not hackable, that are not externally controlled? And that's certainly a conversation that the United States is having with Indonesia.
Great. Yeah, Devi, please.
I think it's an important point about the accusation about the labor expectation. But as Mark mentioned, and you mentioned it, it's Chinese workers in Chinese companies. So as you know, after Reformasi, Indonesia has very robust labor law that protects labor rights. In fact, that was one of the complaints that Mark and other organizations, the Indonesians labor union became extremely strong, and then our labor laws were written by a minister, under Minister of Labor, who used to be head of trade union. In fact, that one of the issues that deterred foreign investment at the time was the issue of labor law. So when it comes to Indonesian labor, they will never be able to get away with accusations of improper terms of employment. But the question is, to what extent is Indonesian labor law applicable to Chinese workers working in a Chinese company in Indonesian territory? And I think this is the issue that needs to be raised. It needs to be made very clear, because I've never heard of any complaint. If there are complaints about Indonesian companies or foreign companies mistreating Indonesian laborers, you can imagine the dozens and dozens of Indonesian trade unions will be up in arms, and they'll be demonstrating.
You have double-headed.
Yeah. But the question is, to what extent is Indonesia, the Indonesian government, enforcing its labor standards on a foreign company employing its own labor? Now, this seems to be the gray area. I would argue Indonesia should not allow extraterritoriality. Its law should be applicable to all companies working in its own territory, including those who are employing their own workers. In the same way that an Indonesian company with Indonesian workers are working in the United States or in a particular state, it should be bound by a law applicable in that state. So in this sense, I think that the issue needs to be raised. To what extent is Indonesia exercising oversight in terms of environment, in terms of health, safety, and issue? These issues need to be raised more. And I think that these issues have not been, the newspapers have written about this. Journalists have raised concerns, environmentalists have raised concerns. So this is an issue that needs to be brought more. And secondly, if there are concerns about labor standards and environment from the United States and others, you'll find lots of partners in Indonesia. As you know, Indonesia has a very robust civil society, has a robust media, has a number of NGOs very active in protection of human rights, environment, health, and so on. So this is not an issue that is going to be like in the new order again. That the whole of Indonesia, like a billiard ball, will be against the United States. So there'll be lots of partners in Indonesia, and I think that this issue of how we should treat a foreign company which brings its own workers working in Indonesia, shouldn't they be under closer supervision, and obey local law, which actually, is quite stringent. And that means that Indonesia needs to pay more attention to that. Instead of saying, oh, those are Chinese workers working for Chinese companies. They're in Indonesia. So they should abide, because reputationally, Indonesia, as you say, are people who do not understand that Indonesia has a very strong labor law. In fact, a lot of investors used to complain that much too pro-labor. That if to avoid this misunderstanding and also to ensure that every company that operates in Indonesia, should be apply rigorously all the standards that are in place in Indonesia, then these issues need to be brought to the table to the Indonesian government as well.
Yeah, Devi, you mentioned extraterritoriality, and it seems to me that all great powers practice it to some extent or the other. The United States has a tradition of that as well. And we always have this tension between a middle power or a smaller, relatively lesser power and a great power in terms of this sort of a question. And it's not entirely new. And but Mark, I want to get to a question raised by a viewer today. Chengpor Aun wants to know a little bit about how this is going to play out. As Piper, you mentioned, we are in election season here. In 3 weeks, we're going to have the result of a new president. It could be one of the candidates, Harris or Trump. Would you care to play out, Mark, to the extent you can? Where will opportunities exist under each? Clearly, there are opportunities on the table here to deepen the relationship. But where do you see opportunities with Donald Trump as president, and where do you see opportunities with Kamala Harris?
Yeah, I think this is a question that a lot of governments in Southeast Asia are certainly wrestling with and exploring as we are speaking and thinking about it as well. I think from the perspective of some of these governments, for a Trump administration, for example, I think the campaign talk, and I preface it that way because lots of things get said during a campaign that never have the chance of becoming reality in an actual government. But nonetheless, the campaign talk of higher tariffs for all countries that maybe are exporting more goods to the United States. I think the sense that from the previous Trump administration, where there was certainly a lower value placed on engaging ASEAN as a group and more of a focus on just maybe engaging on a bilateral basis with individual countries, would certainly give other governments a reason to pause and potentially explore how they might hedge certain types of engagement opportunities. And the good thing, I think, for a country like Indonesia, because it's also its location and being part of ASEAN, Indonesia has a full menu of opportunities, of initiatives, of frameworks, of agreements that it could certainly pursue in its interests if it found that a Trump administration wasn't very open to some of the things that it might have. So, for example, we know the administration of President Joko Widodo has repeatedly proposed that Indonesia would like to have a bilateral critical minerals agreement with the United States, like the United States has with other countries. And we know, for our own reasons, including domestic politics, the answer has been, yeah, it's not going to happen. We'll talk about it, but we're not prepared to do anything. It'll be interesting to see if President Prabowo once again reiterates that interest to the United States, and whether Harris administration, how they might respond might be one way. How a Trump administration might respond could be interesting, because we do know there from previous experience, the Trump administration seems to be much more comfortable looking at doing quote unquote deals and like sector specific deals. And who knows, maybe a Trump administration might be open to some type of a mineral deal with Indonesia. Time will tell there. I think the other thing that for a Harris administration, once again, there's so much opportunity to build upon the current trajectory from the Biden administration and the Joko administration, leveraging the comprehensive strategic partnership, which elevated the bilateral relationships. There are initiatives that are now being seeded under sort of that CSP, like using funds to help Indonesia maybe develop an ecosystem that allow it to plug into the global supply chain for semiconductor chips, for example. A Harris administration, I would expect, could have a degree of continuity and then continue those types of initiatives, which I would assume would be welcomed by the Prabowo administration going forward. So that might be, again, more of a continuity win-win scenario for both governments when they come online in 2025.
Great. Piper, please.
Just really quick to add on to what Mark said, two things I would predict will remain, whether we see a Harris or a Trump administration. The US will still look at the region as the Indo-Pacific. We saw that with the last two administrations. It's very clearly a way that the United States is comfortable focusing on Southeast Asia and ASEAN centrality, but within this broader region of the Indo-Pacific. The other is the frame of U.S. China competition. And we've alluded to it or referenced it, implied it, but I think it's just important to say that regardless of whether we're in a Harris or Trump administration, the U.S. perception of China as a near peer competitor, especially in the Indo-Pacific, is going to shape either administration's view. And in a way, I think that provides opportunities for Southeast Asia. And it's important for Southeast Asia to be thinking actively, as I know the countries of Southeast Asia are, about how to engage in the space of this greater US-China competition.
Yeah, indeed. It's always struck me when I look at the Trump period and the Biden period, how much continuity and commonality there is when it comes to Asia. After all, the Quad was revived under President Trump in 2017 in his second incarnation, and that's been maintained and strengthened and deepened. So there's no reason to expect that if President Trump comes back, that would change, that trajectory would change. It would probably continue. Staying with you, Piper, just on this question of, you wrote in your report about how the U.S. lattice work approach is very much, and you went into some depth on that. Now, here we have currently a situation in the South China Sea, where China is directly a participant. It's made some provocative moves. There's clearly a Chinese claim. I'm just referring now to the China-Philippines tussle. There's a claim, the 9-dash line, that's been ruled illegal by an international tribunal. There have been certain jostling, actually more than jostling. There have been injuries in these scuffles recently. What is your own sense? Is this lattice work approach helping manage this challenge of the Philippines-China tussle? Of course, there are bilateral things happening there as well. But from the U.S. perspective, is the lattice work approach helping, or does it have also its own provocative elements that you would point to? How would you play that, the two sides?
The U.S.-Philippine relationship is stronger right now than it's been at any time in the last 10 years. And I think that the U.S. support to the Philippines has been extremely important as the Philippines deals with this frankly provocative behavior and continuing. And U.S. officials just last week referred to the Chinese behavior as dangerous. I was hoping to see stronger support for the Philippines position voiced by other countries in Southeast Asia, including in the context of the just concluded East Asia Summit. I think there's some concern in the region that when the Philippines pushes and China responds, that heightens the dynamic and heightens the space for escalation. However, if other countries aren't supporting the Philippines, calling for
I think we.
Oops, did you lose me?
Just for a second. You're back. You're back now.
Countries need to support the Philippines and call for international norms, would be the short answer.
Great. Well, in the remaining time we have, which is barely a minute or two, I'm going to give Devi the last word on this. Anything you'd add to what Piper Campbell has said on the issue of the China-Philippines tussle and where Indonesia might fit in with Prabowo coming in?
Yeah, a bit of competition. It's something to be welcome because it gives opportunities and choices to other countries. But we need to be much more careful now in today's climates where, certain other parts of the world are clearly, in a hot war. The Middle East is in a very dangerous situation now. The situation between Russia and Ukraine is still never ending. And it's, after all, it's not that long ago that the Southeast Asia was a place that's regarded to be, one of the most dangerous places in the world, where we do not count deaths by the hundreds, but by the millions. Northeast Asia is also, that is the case. So this is when conflict occurs in Asia, the victims will be in the millions because of just the sheer size of the population. And the trade value and the economic, weight of Asia now is so much part of the value of the global economy. So ASEAN is always in the belief that it's always better to talk. ASEAN may be a talk shop, but it's better to just talk and not to fire weapons at each other. So a bit of, jingoism is fine, but be very careful that sometimes small incidents at sea or the death of an archduke, could lead to something much bigger than that. So when conflict happens, sometimes it's much more difficult to control. It's like when you start a fire and when the whole tinder is dry, you don't always are in a position to be able to put that down. So for Indonesia, for ASEAN, for all parts of the region, so superpowers will compete with each other, fine. But superpowers don't end up killing each other in their own land. They always use other people's theaters, the other countries. And Southeast Asia has been the theater during the Vietnam War. Cambodian suffered just a collateral damage. Laos suffered some collateral damage. The whole part of Southeast Asia suffered. And now, the whole world will also be damaged because the sea lanes of communications of the trade pass through Southeast Asia. So for us, global competition, the U.S. China, do not look at it in a zero-sum game. This is not the Cold War anymore. There are many areas where the U.S. and China and everybody, other countries, need to work together. We have so many issues that we need to deal with. We are all living in the same planet. We are all faced with the challenges of climate change, which, interestingly, is not being raised as an issue here. Usually, it's very difficult to avoid conversations about climate change. Global pandemics, we seem to have forgotten. There's just a couple of years ago, just last year, that many of us were still wearing masks. So
I am again.
Don't lose sight. Don't lose sight of the fact that peace has to be nurtured, and if you want to have peace, you do not only just prepare for war, but you actually work for peace, nurture the peace. Never take it for granted. And I think, I would call on both the United States and China and all the other countries, including the middle powers and the small powers, because quite often it's what happened in a small power, a place called Serbia, that led to the First World War. So this is something that should never be talked again dismissively, while you're drinking your sherry in your drawing room, talk theoretically about wars. In our part of the world, it is not an academic issue. It's real life for us. So, and I think that this is not something that we can dismiss lightly. So, talking about having decoupling, having, completely bipolar world in a world that is already totally engaged. I don't know whether Marx, a businessman, can really say, I want to disengage. Everybody still wants to trade with China. China is our biggest market, but we want to trade with the United States too. It's still a very important market for us. So we want to be able to work together. the most important thing is how do we manage the various tensions, manage the various issues. Trade alone is not going to make peace because, after all, you had the trade war, and various trade frictions have led to conflicts. But this is something where win-win solution can still be found. You lose some here and you win some there. Why bring the guns into it?
Indeed, on this note, we shall end. I will just interject one thought. I am optimistic about Indonesia and Southeast Asia because I think, in fact, some of you have said this, that we are not in the world of the Cold War in many important ways, that middle powers in the global South have some agency, at least to try and manage their regions and influence their own regions, if not the great power competition per se. So let's hope for the best, that we don't have another crisis of a violent sort in Asia. We already have one in the Middle East and Europe, and that we continue to see a deeper and better relationship between the United States and Indonesia and the broader region. With that, thank you all very much for being our guests, and look forward to a next time. And thank you to all the viewers.